when my best friend Jake and I were in our early 20s. We decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the mountains of Montana. Jake had inherited the cabin from his grandfather, who had passed away a few years prior. It was a place Jake had visited often as a kid, but for me, it was my first time. I was 23 and Jake was 24. We both had jobs that allowed us to take long weekends, so we packed up his truck and headed out on a Thursday afternoon to avoid the weekend rush. The drive was long but scenic, winding through dense forests and along the edges of steep cliffs. The further we got from civilization, the more the landscape seemed to close in around us. Towering pines lined the narrow dirt road, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the only sounds were crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional call of a distant bird. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with a large stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost deafening after the noise of the city. Jake parked the truck, and we began unloading our gear. Jake, being the outdoorsy type, took charge of setting up the cabin while I unloaded our gear. He had a knack for making things feel homey, even in the middle of nowhere. He started a fire in the fireplace, and the warmth quickly filled the room. We cracked open a couple of beers and sat by the fire, reminiscing about old times and planning our hikes for the next few days. The first night passed without incident. We grilled steaks on the porch, played cards, and listened to music on a portable speaker. The stars were incredible, so bright and clear that it felt like you could reach out and touch them. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how far removed we were from the chaos of everyday life. But the second night was different. It started with a sound. Around midnight, as we were getting ready to turn in, we heard a faint knocking on the front door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it grew louder. Jake and I exchanged glances. We weren't expecting anyone, and the nearest town was miles away. "Maybe it's an animal," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. He grabbed a flashlight and a hunting knife from the kitchen drawer and cautiously approached the door. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. When he opened the door, there was no one there, just the dark, empty forest stretching out in front of us. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed ominously. Jake shone the flashlight around the porch and into the woods, but there was no sign of anyone. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice was uneasy. We locked the door and double-checked the windows before heading upstairs to bed. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees outside made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the roof, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Jake, in the next room, seemed to be sleeping soundly. The next morning, we decided to explore the surrounding woods. Jake wanted to show me a nearby lake, where he used to fish with his grandfather. The hike was beautiful, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we reached the lake, the feeling only intensified. The water was still and dark, reflecting the gray sky above. Jake cast a line into the water, but I stayed on the shore, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it, a figure, barely visible through the dense foliage. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, and it seemed to be watching us. "Jake," I whispered, my voice trembling. "There's someone in the trees." He turned, following my gaze, but by then the figure was gone. "Probably just a deer," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. We packed up and headed back to the cabin, the unease hanging heavy between us. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Jake grabbed the knife again and opened the door, but once more, there was no one there. We searched the perimeter of the cabin, but the forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. As we turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the porch, a small, crude doll made of sticks and twine. Its eyes were 2 black stones, and it seemed to be staring right at us. Jake picked it up, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. We didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. At one point, I thought I saw a face press against a window, but when I looked again, it was gone. Jake insisted we stay put until morning, but I was ready to leave right then and there. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft tapping on the window. I froze, my heart pounding, as a shadow moved across the glass. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath catching my throat. A face was pressed against the window, its features distorted by the glass. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I screamed, scrambling out of bed and running to Jake's room. "There's someone outside," I shouted, shaking him awake. He grabbed a knife and flashlight, and we searched the perimeter of the cabin. But there was no one there. The only evidence of the encounter was a smudge on the window, as if someone had pressed their face against it. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, we heard whispers in the woods. They were faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. The voices seemed to come from all directions, overlapping and indistinct, like a chorus of ghosts. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice tight with fear. We packed up the truck as quickly as we could, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see the figure standing in the clearing, watching us go. We never talked about what happened that weekend. Jake sold the cabin a few months later, and we never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knocking, and I wonder what, or who, was out there in the woods,